Good evening and welcome to the CJC Conversations with your co-host, Edward Woods III, and my brother from another mother, Pastor Christian Josiah, was unable to be with us, but we will have Pastor Kerwin Jones. And this evening, we're going to tackle the topic, are Adventists, I repeat, are Adventists still abolitionists? And we are excited with this star-studded panel who has been involved, been engaged, in this work for quite some time, brilliant researchers and professionals. And without further ado, we're going to bring them right in. We do want to share with you, as we always do, we want to share with you that the views and opinions expressed are personal in nature and not reflective of the Conscience of Justice Council or any organization represented by the host or the guest. Just want to share that with you. And we just want to thank you for coming to the CJC Conversations, where we seek to educate, empower, and engage you on topics related to conscience and justice. So please encourage your family, your friends, and your foes to join us for these important conversations that we have in celebration of Black History Month, a century of Black history commemorations, preserve, promote, and protect. Once again, let's bring in our guests as we tackle the topic, are Adventists still abolitionists? All the way from the Great Central States Conference, the Associate Youth Director and the Associate Pastor of the Linwood Boulevard Seventh-day Adventist Church, a brilliant person in her own right, a kind person in her own right, and a graduate of Oakwood University. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our very own Pastor Liz Adams.
Thank you.
Yes, we got a professor in the house, that is not only academic, but practical in the work that she does in the Collegedale area, in her community. Everyone knows Miss Lisa, but we're excited to have someone of her caliber who's a professor of political science, Dr. Lisa Clark Diller from Southern University. Let's welcome our friend, Lisa Clark Diller. Welcome to the broadcast.
It's great to be here again, Ed. Thanks.
Thank you. And then we have another doctor in the house, a scholar in his own right, a theologian in his own right, and the director of Archive Statistics and Trends for the North American Division, has a new book that was recently released, and we'll talk about that. He's written the 1919 Fundamentalists, the 1922 Fundamentalists, and even an Oxford Handbook. He is an editor in his own right, a scholar and a preacher. Let's welcome none other than Dr. Michael Campbell.
Dr. Woods, good to see you, my friend.
And last but not least, we can't have a show without the legendary Kevin Burton, Dr. Kevin Burton, who is the director of the Center of Adventist Research at Andrews University and an upcoming author on the apocalyptic abolitionism, is going to be coming out, I believe, in June. I already pre-ordered. I follow instructions very well, Lisa. He said to order the book, so I ordered the book. I got my mother to actually go to Mueller Hall to get Michael's book. So I just follow instructions. And if they write something, we just go ahead and just purchase the book. But Dr. Kevin Burton, we appreciate you being with us this evening. All right, we're going to get. Thank you very much. We're going to go right at it and not waste anyone's time because everybody is traveling. I just want everybody to know everyone here has made a commitment to being here, but they are literally traveling. They are not in their home studios. And I just want to thank you for your appreciation and sharing. But the question that we were raising today, very simple, straightforward question. Are Adventists still abolitionists? And we want to go, yes, we want you to answer the question, yes or no, and why. And then we'll start from the pioneers and then get where we are today. So right now, we just want to answer the question, yes or no, and why, from your perspective, and why Adventists are still abolitionists. We will start off with Dr. Kevin Burton.
Okay, well, I'll give a yes and no answer to that question. I think that there are many good Adventists who are still advocates for social and specifically racial justice. But as a whole, I'm not so convinced that we're there. I think that we are largely not there. So most Adventists probably, I think it's pretty evident that we're not. And there's a great need because there are all kinds of forms of slavery that are rife in the world. There is a lot of slavery regarding things like chocolate, coffee, stuff like that. And we have, I mean, everyone in America who is paying any attention to the news is familiar with the Epstein stuff, which is now being talked about as the largest sex trafficking sort of ring in possibly world history. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's at least, sort of a buzz around that. And so there's things like sex slavery that is just a tragic problem. And in addition to that, it's not just slavery per se, but the abolitionists were also advocating for equal rights for uh, people of color in the U.S. And so that is still an ongoing project as well. And so, yeah, we need to be abolitionists today. Some Adventists are living up to the standard that I think God wants us to live to, but I think most of us probably aren't.
Okay. Dr. Lisa Clark Diller.
I would say the Advent message is still abolitionist, and some Adventists are abolitionists, but I think most of us aren't. And I think, I agree with everything that Kevin has said. I would add that our message allows for us to kind of keep leaning into that stream. I think maybe not all Adventists were equally involved in abolitionist projects, even at the beginning, even if they kind of paid lip service to that. And so I think our desire, like if we think about abolition, if we're using that metaphorically to be about the things that are unjust in the world, as I was kind of explaining to my parents about what this panel was going to be about, my dad was like, but abolition isn't like a thing like that. That's an anachronistic kind of term in the past. What do we mean by that? And I was like, well, I assume it means working for justice in this world, even as we are proclaiming the soon coming of Jesus. And so are we doing that? Millerites were wanting to change the laws of the land, even though maybe they thought Jesus was coming like that year or the next year. And so are we still doing that? And I do think we really struggle. And I would say probably most of us are not doing that. Even though I think Adventism, the idea of what our church came out of, is still abolitionist.
All right, Liz, Pastor Liz.
I'm going to go with a no. I don't believe, and I love how Dr. Diller just put it, actively working. I don't think we as a Adventist community or even as a church are actively working to end injustice around us. And so simply put, I believe that when you're an abolitionist, when we look at our pioneers, we see people who oppose slavery, both morally and theologically, like across the board. They were like, and listen, I'm not a historian at all, so I'm here to learn as well. But we saw people who interpreted slavery as divine judgment. It was a grave evil in the sight of the Lord. And so they were actively working towards ending it. And I don't think that we as a church are, I don't think we have that stance. I think at this point, it's just one of those things because, and we'll talk about why later. I mean, I want to hear what the professors have to say, but I'm going to go with a no.
Dr. Michael.
You're
You're
on
on
mute.
mute.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? There we go. Sorry. It's a complex question and it deserves a complex answer because there's no easy solution to what you just asked. And I would like to think Adventism at its best. So should Adventism be abolitionist? And I would say absolutely. We should be fighting for freedom and justice. Do we live up to the ideal? And this is, as historians, we look back and say, well, oftentimes we don't live up to the ideals, and it's a fluid thing where we see high points and we see low points along that story. Certainly, we celebrate things like the earliest Adventists being abolitionists, people like Ellen White, who said to fight against the fugitive slave law. Now, I think when it comes to today, we have to ask ourselves the question, are we willing to do something about it? So we like to always valorize ourselves in history that, oh, if I lived back then, I would have been an abolitionist if I had lived in the 19th century. Well, would you really? And if you're not willing to do something about it in the present, it's very unlikely that you would have done anything about it in the past. So that's the thing is history challenges us. It should prick our hearts. And I remember writing about, some of the different things in Adventist history about race relations and different things like that. And I remember thinking when we had discussions about the Black Lives Matter, my best friend at the college I was teaching at wanted to go march in the Black Lives Matter, said, would you come with me? And I had to ask myself the question, if I'm really serious about my faith, my Adventism, the things that I teach in the classroom, I have to be willing to do something about it in the present and hold his hand as we walk together in peaceful protest. And that's not to uplift myself. It's just to say that we do need to ask ourselves the hard questions. How are we living our lives?
Well, thank you. What I want to do is go in segments so we can kind of follow. So you mentioned the fugitive slave law, so we can go from there. Let's just say to 1900. And then I want to go from 1900 to 1950, and then 1950 to 2000, and then 2000 to the present. That way we can kind of break it up and have a flow. But one of the things that, the language that our pioneers used was very strong, very direct. Some may call it even offensive when it talks about slavery and some of the whitewashing that was emanating from the pulpits. But to put it in a contemporary time, their Episcopal Bishop, Rob Hirschfield from New Hampshire, at a vigil for Renee Good, said this: I have asked clergy to get their affairs in order, to make sure they have their wills written, because it may be that now is no longer the time for statements, but for us with our bodies to stand between the powers of this world and the most vulnerable. That resonated with me as language that we could have possibly heard from our Adventist pioneers between 1850 and 1900. Share your thoughts on that, and then anything else that during that time frame that could be helpful as relates to our discussion. Kevin, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right, Eddie. In the abolitionist movement broadly, but then I think we see it too in the Millerite and Adventist variety as well. There was a strong sense of martyrdom as a real threat, and there's a lot of discussion about that in the primary sources. I talk about it a little bit in my forthcoming book, but it is a real kind of thing. And that fits in with Adventist eschatology too, with this idea of persecution at the end of time. And the Adventists believed that they were living in that end time and that Christ was coming at any moment. And so the threat of martyrdom was a real thing for them. And it was backed up with actual violence that happened often enough, where mobs would attack the Millerites in their worship services, and the authorities would do nothing to quell it. So, for example, in Boston in October 1844, the Millerites are trying to meet in the tabernacle, and ruffians are throwing rocks through the windows. They are accosting women on the sidewalks and barring people from entry. They are breaking in while they're worshiping. They are breaking up and destroying pews or benches. And it's so bad, and there's so many people, and it is so violent that the authorities come in and they prevent and disallow the Millerites from meeting there for worship. This is why, by the way, that Joshua B. Himes goes to Lowhampton, New York, and waits out the great disappointment with William Miller. He wasn't able to be with his flock, and that's because of violence. And so violence was a sort of an evidence that, yes, martyrdom is a reality, and they weren't necessarily wrong. They weren't necessarily wrong. But they were ultimately wrong about the second coming of Christ, of course. But there was a potential because it was violent. That's what I'm trying to say.
All right, Liz.
Yeah, I appreciate, man, Dr. Burton laying that out. Like, I think there was definitely the the idea that like they were willing to lay their lives down, right, for their brothers and their sisters. And that's huge. Um, Ellen White, I feel like they were very, I think it was Ellen White had talked about returning slaves, right? That's one of the biggest things we hear when we talk about this is that Ellen White was talking about, hey, go against the law, like go against the law of the land and return the slaves, and do not return slaves. Who they're saying, hey, if you find a runaway slave, return them. And I think we have to be willing in the same way to like understand that as others. I'm always of this mindset of like it's not so much politics as much as it's just human rights. Like, what is the right thing to do? How do we minimize harm to each other, right? Whether that was back in the 1800s or whether that's 2026. How do we minimize the harm that we do to each other? And I think a big part of that is like putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and saying, hey, I have to somehow be willing to be uncomfortable because someone else is uncomfortable. And slavery was such a sin before God as our pioneers saw it, that Ellen White like wrote about the slaveholder being accountable to God for the soul of the slave, right? Like the cry of the oppressed have come up before God, and he will surely avenge the wrongs done to the slave. And I think we kind of have to have that same stance. Not even kind of, we have to have that same stance. Like we are accountable for the people around us. And so when there's suffering and when there's hurt happening around us, we have to be able to step into that space and say, you know what, I am going to be accountable for my brother and my sister.
Thank you. Lisa?
We're going all the way up to 1900 in this question?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So, this is, Michael can probably say more about this than I can in terms of like our early missionaries. And as we think about missions and globally, like, so we're kind of a little US centric here, which is fine. We can't talk about everything everywhere all the time, but coming in post the Civil War, I think Adventists were similar to lots of people, including lots of abolitionists, most the white abolitionists, especially from before the Civil War, which is after the Civil War, there's a huge desire to just like put everybody together. Let's make peace. Let's kind of come together and like heal the wounds. And that happens with the end of Reconstruction, sort of on the backs of Black Americans, because it's a way of kind of like, let's unify kind of around that. And so I think Adventists after that I think we did collectively as a church, a lot of work for, like a lot of churches did, for the newly freed folks in the South. There was definitely an attempt to do that and to like help improve lives. But I think our focus was less on changing laws around that kind of justice. And I think Dr. Burton, I've heard him talk about it, about some of what even the temperance movement that we have could be seen as a work for justice for women. So it's possible that we still were thinking a little bit more politically, but I think we went much more to saying, let's spread the gospel And when I look at that early section of the church and I see how many women and people of color were involved, especially like how we opened our medical schools to a wide diverse people, I'm proud of that, but I don't think it was done out of the same spirit that abolitionism was done, which is like, let's do this because it's the just thing. I think everyone was so sold out for the mission of spreading the gospel of Jesus' soon return that it was like all hands on deck. And they sort of let and that mission can really help promote egalitarianism and equality early on in a church community. But I don't know that it was because we were justice seeking, in general. So I have some mixed feelings about what happened in that period after the Civil War.
Okay, Michael.
So I like to explain it to my, students would often ask questions of, how does this all make sense if you believe the world's going to end and it's going to burn, then why bother? Because I mean, at the very least, even if you strive for these things, then God's going to, resolve them. He can take care of the problem, and the issues solved. And Adventists, and I call this the Adventist paradox. It's exactly the opposite. In fact, the more our earliest pioneers, since we're talking about these early formative years, the more they waited with fervent expectancy that Jesus is coming, the more they began to work for a little bit of heaven here on earth. And so because of that became a theological rationale and a foundation, which I think surprises a lot of people. Like, why would you care? Jesus is coming. It's the end of the world. But precisely because Jesus is coming, we care even more. And so that we should do something about it, and how we live our lives makes a difference. And whether it's, talking before the Civil War, I think one thing that's very interesting for me that I've been kind of focused or honing in on recently is not just, the issue of race, and Lisa mentioned also gender. I think our early pioneers were very egalitarian, at least in the terms of the founding of the church. They were also worried about immigration. And as there was a xenophobic push in America, especially in the latter half, since you're going up to 1900, the 1860s and the post-Civil War, that was a setting in which there was the National Reform Association, these kinds of things that were pushing towards, kinds of control and pushing out immigrants. And these would lead to Sunday laws. And Ellen White would critique that. And that's where I think our apocalyptic viewpoint and our understanding of the great controversy, our theology is really ripe for being able to be a critiquer of empire and the abuse of power within society. And our theology critiques that very much. And so Ellen White warns against, and these same groups, the NRA, would be the same ones that will push for Sunday legislation, Sunday laws. And so it's striking to me that we have that kind of prophetic lens through which even the prophetic founding voice of Adventism could see the dangers of empire and the abuse of power.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Reconstruction during this time period, the Kilgore policy that came during this time period, and how that may have shifted and altered some things. And then I want to, as we go into 1900, most of you are aware of the integrated church at First Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Washington, D.C. area. And so we were like the leaders. We were covered as, how in the world can this work with regards to an integrated church? So I was very pleased to see through your works and other works, the advantage and the leadership of Adventism that so often goes unnoticed, and it creates sometimes a schism between blacks and whites. But I realized there's I don't want to say illiterate, but it seems like there is a lot of illiteracy when it comes to our Adventist roots. And so I really want to kind of talk about the Reconstruction and what changed with regards to that, getting to the Kilgore policy, and then let's transition to 1900 to 1950. Kevin, can you start?
Sure. Yeah, so Adventism is a northern religious movement, and we weren't really in the South until after the Civil War. And in 1865, we actually passed a resolution that we need to go basically evangelize the free people in the South. But it takes a while, and we lag behind other northern, mostly abolitionist groups that started doing some kinds of things, like the American Missionary Association, that goes down and immediately starts teaching the free people and evangelizing, etc. We have a few individuals who will go. Joseph and Sarah Clark are my favorite. They're radical abolitionists. They go down to Texas, down where Southwestern Adventist University is today, and they refuse to segregate. They are adamantly opposed to what Joseph Clark calls the great goddess caste, and he says that he had to speak out so strongly against the great goddess caste that it was causing trouble. Well, he's working there with Kilgore, who you mentioned, and there becomes a sort of an argument back and forth because people are worried about their safety. The Ku Klux Klan is lynching people at a very fast clip, and Kilgore is wanting to not have white people work for black people, and he wants blacks to work for blacks and whites to work for whites. And Joseph and Sarah Clark refuse, and they end up, after everyone on both sides of the racial divide is begging them to leave, because they're like, we have to segregate to move forward for our own safety and survival. The Clarks will leave, and then this policy, what we sometimes call the Kilgore policy, it becomes the standard and the norm in the South. And that will be out of necessity, primarily. But eventually this will become something that people think is divinely ordained from God. And so that's a problem. There is the People's Church in DC. It is integrated racially, but then the GC headquarters are going to move from Battle Creek to that area, and Daniels, A.G. Daniels.
Okay, we lost him. Lisa, can you go until we get him back?
I'm not going to be able to say what Kevin was saying. Michael might be better at that. But I do think that our church is not uninfluenced by culture around it, and things got worse in terms of race relations. I think sometimes we think about like progress going this way, but like there was a lot of like options for people after the Civil War for Black Americans, and then they kind of dropped off. And the last Black congressman leaves Congress in DC in 1900, and so we see our church leadership as time goes on starting to kind of reflect influenced by Southern Adventists, and we want to blame Southerners, but like white Southerners are not the only racists in our church. We have other people, like sometimes we like to like say it's just the South that's like that, but there was prejudice and segregation in the Midwest and in the Northeast and things like that as well. So, but I think our church started being influenced, and when it moved to DC, I don't know if that's where Kevin was going, often being influenced by some of the Southern leadership and became more segregated. They brought their policies kind of with them as they came into leadership. And so there is sort of a decline narrative a little bit there, I think, in our church, that by the time we get to World War II, we're really sort of embracing some of the standards of the wider United States.
Thank you. Liz?
I'm definitely going to agree with Dr. Diller. I'm not much of a historian, so I can't really. I think I can give my opinion on what was going on during the how the Kilgore policy affected what we did. I mean, this idea of like um people just had to kind of govern themselves, right? So like separate congregations, separate schools, separate leadership structures in many of our of our organizations. And I think in a way, I mean, Ellen White said that we would do this until we had a better option. But we are, years away from that. And we we still don't have a better option. We're still in this space as we are. And so, in a way, I think it was supposed to be a temporary band-aid, and yet, like, we just continue to sit with it. Um, and so the question is there a better way? I think I would ask, like, is there a better way for us to do it now? Because this was part of where, as far as I know, this is part of where our regional conferences kind of came out of as well, right? This idea of separate but yet still the same. And I just I think that we could have definitely looked at, or we could definitely at this point look at what is a better way in moving forward. Everything that happens in our past, like, we can look back at it, and we have to be able to learn from it so that we can move forward. But that's as far as I know of the Kilgore policy.
Thank you. Kevin, you're back, so I'll let you go ahead and finish. Kevin, can you hear me? I don't know if Kevin can hear me. Kevin, can you hear me? Kevin, can you hear me? He's not able to hear me. Okay, Michael.
Sure. So, in this month's issue of Adventist Journey, for anybody that gets that in, most Adventist homes get that in North America. I have a 2-page spread on the work of Edson White, the Morning Star, and a newly discovered photo of the Morning Star, which is kind of cool. But if you're not familiar with that story, that's this boat that goes up and down the Mississippi River and its tributaries.
A little bit.
You want to finish, Kevin, your thought? Can you?
I'm sorry. I don't know if, my internet is so bad, and I heard virtually nothing of what was said, but I was just going to try to summarize how the Kilgore policy swept across the South, and then segregation moved further up north. And eventually just racism became institutionalized. But maybe I'll leave it there, and maybe I can get in on another question. I don't even know if you can hear me now. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Okay, Michael.
So just to finish about Edson White. So, it's interesting because he was the black sheep of the family, always getting himself in trouble, and was an utter failure. I mean, so when he has a reconversion, church leaders don't want to give him anything to do because he just is a disaster. And after his conversion, he picks up his mother's pamphlet appealing for missionaries to go down south and break down racial barriers and to do something about it. And he has this kind of captures the possibility of what might happen because of what's happened in the past and concerns about what might happen from there. He has to be a self-supporting worker. I think my friend Carmela, colleague from Message, so shout out to her. And absolutely right, Ellen White would use some of her own funds and royalties to be able to help support that, saying, hey, this is absolutely what the church needs. And so, and he'll do something amazing going on that boat, risking his life, building churches and schools. There's stories reported of the Ku Klux Klan trying to burn down one of his church schools, that they just weren't able to do it. And so there's this kind of, it's an amazing adventure story. And I think this shows some of the best in Adventism of trying to break down racial barriers and to do missionary work that ultimately would be successful. He would lay the groundwork for many others to follow after him. So we talk about forward steps. We talk about maybe backward steps where the church doesn't live up to those ideals. But this is one of those bright spots, I think, in Adventist history where we really see something avant-garde and creative that does make an impact. And as a result of that work, and despite people trying to even kill him and destroy the boat, that establishes a whole series of missionary outposts through the South, and that will be a significant push forward for the work for during this Reconstruction period for African Americans in the South.
Thank you, Mike. I think it's very important to me to really share our history and also share, although our system may not have been supportive, there have always been people. God has always had a remnant, a diverse remnant, women, men, white, black, yellow, red, brown, to speak truth to power and to remind us what he is all about. You know, we can't be our disciples if we don't have love for one another. And each of you bring a unique perspective to that, sometimes even at your own peril, in terms of how people have come at you and have disrespected you as a human being created in the image and likeness of God. But if we do not get the truth out there, I'm concerned because our young people are looking at other avenues. You know, there's a lot of regret that the Black Lives Matter movement was a secular movement and not run by the church, because people are questioning the effectiveness of the church when it comes to human rights and dignity. From 1900 to 1950, we still have segregation going on. We've had Ellen White died. We've had the rise of the fundamentalist movement. We've had the beginning of regional conferences. We've had World War I. We've had World War II. You know, all of these things were happening between 1900 and 1950. You had the segregation of the People's Church, now known as First Seventh-day Adventist Church, with Louis Sheaf and Washburn. You know, all of that's happening during that time. So kind of talk about that period and, you know, some of the things that are kind of highlights, because well, there's still some good points there, even though there might have been more bad points. There's still some good stuff points there that were very fruitful, you know, for our church. So Michael, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, well, this is my time period I enjoy the most in terms of research and writing, early 20th century. And sometimes, you know, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so you see certainly some of the challenges of that the church is facing. I know Kevin mentioned the institutionalization of segregation, these kinds of things that by the end of Ellen White's lifetime, I think people began to forget the earliest ideals that our church had been founded in. And as there were theological and sociological and political shifts in the United States, we begin to see that especially there was a strong appeal towards fundamentalism, very militant way of reading inspired writings. And this lent itself, it didn't by itself because but it's kind of complex, but it lent itself to a proof texting kind of way of approaching inspired writings, including Ellen White's writings. So you begin to see in the early 20th century where there's sort of proof texting of Ellen White that actually makes her sound like she's for segregation. If you read selectively and quote selectively when she's dealing with very specific circumstances, you could make her sound like institutionalized racism that the America was moving towards and the church was moving towards, so that by the 20th century, and I don't know what year exactly that this happened, but the General Conference cafeteria was actually segregated. You began to have people that were Adventist authors like Arthur W. Spalding, who's writing about and others. He's not the only one, about how there would be a black and white heaven. So you begin to see that there's sort of, and we can almost like, where in the world? But and among the fundamentalists, not all fundamentalists, there were some that began to get swept up in the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. So and that was anti-immigrant again, which I talked about earlier. How this is, you know, people, the xenophobic pushes seem to always get us in trouble. The second wave of the Klan was for private education. It was anti-Catholic, you know, people that were different, right? These Catholic immigrants. And just like among the fundamentalists, that there were some that were really drawn to this kind of rhetoric in the, especially in the early 1920s. There were some Adventists that got swept up in the Klan, which is one of the most incredulous things I found in Adventist history, to find actual Adventists, even some church leaders that were participants, not just they happened to stop by, but they were participants in these kinds of Klan rallies. And that has to be some of the most heartbreaking research I've ever done is to do research into this sort of thing. And I have some people even say, well, why even mention this? Just let's talk about the happy things in Adventist history. But we do have to be honest about our history. And so I tell people we have to tell the stories, the history that we find, not what we wish we found. And so this is where theology matters. How we understand inspired writings, how we study inspired writings matters. And in this instance, the proclivity, the temptation towards fundamentalism, at least created the environment, the circumstances. And again, I'm not here to say that all Adventists that were attracted to fundamentalism went into the Ku Klux Klan, but it was a dangerous temptation. It was almost intoxicating. And we certainly see that Adventism made some significant backward steps in the early 20th century.
Talk about women, Michael. Your research really talked about women.
I'm not the only one. Actually, Kevin has done this too. He might even comment on this more. But by 1910, I think, Kevin, this came from, well, there's a couple different sources, I guess. But it's been estimated maybe 1,000 women were in leadership as pastors and even missionaries in different kinds of ways. And by 1930, after the heyday of fundamentalism in the 1920s, by 1930, there was almost none. And so I've had some people say, oh, there's no way there were that many women in Adventist history, at that time. No way. And I tell people, just because you don't know their stories doesn't mean they didn't exist. So I've been on this campaign for like 3-4 years now, where I try to write a story of an unknown woman in Adventist history. And because this is a historian's revenge. Okay, you're going to tell me, you're going to critique and say, oh, there's no way, that's impossible. Okay, so I'm going to prove it to you one by one and shame you in a nice way by showing you, telling you those stories, those untold stories. And so, which tells me that how we do history matters, and that it behooves us that we write history that's more inclusive in terms of race and gender and so on, because how we tell those stories makes all the difference.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, so we're talking about Adventists in the early part of the 20th century. And as we got more segregated, and of course the conferences, the separate conferences don't come up until the 40s and, after World War II. But even before that, Black Adventists, women, the people that have been disenfranchised were doing God's work, like anyway. Like they found ways to raise money. They found ways to spread the gospel at great cost to themselves. And it was, a ton of Black women in the Adventist church that are just doing the yeoman's work of fundraising, handing out pamphlets, organizing. And so I think, sometimes when we think about, are we still abolitionists, we think about white abolitionists, and we do want those, but we also, oh, hello, Pastor. But we also need to acknowledge that people were doing it anyway. We had people in our Black Adventist church that was growing and working in spite of all the disadvantages.
Liz?
Yeah, so I think it's easy to forget that this wasn't even that long ago, right? This is less than 100 years ago. And when we look at this early Adventist movement, they really worked to confront. I think they really worked to confront injustice. It was hard to ignore. It was hard to ignore that there was such a racial divide within the world, or not even the world, within the U.S., within North America, and therefore it trickled into the church. And I think that's one of the things. Dr. Campbell had talked about how stories matter. Stories matter. We don't see people's stories, and this is why, being Pacific Islander, one of the things that we do is we always say we have to tell our own stories. We have to be able to tell our own stories. And so I applaud the professors on here, because you guys are telling our stories. You're telling our stories as Adventists. And this idea of our early church was really against they were really about confronting slavery, like as a moral apocalypse. Like, this is wrong. This is a stain on our nation. It's a stain on our church. And I think by like the early mid 20, like the early, yeah, like the early 20th century, we find out that like Adventism had grown from just being this church, and they were going into institutionalizing themselves. And so while they're doing that, they're still dealing with like war, right? Segregation. They're having to deal with expansion. Like all of these things are playing a role in what we were doing. And I like to say that like we might not have gotten it right all the time, but I think it's important to also know that like we were fumbling in love. Right, like there was legit, like our early pioneers had love for each other, and we were fumbling within that love, because we see that like there's the formation of the regional conferences that come out of that. And Dr. Rock writes in his book Protest and Progress, and he writes about like how that was an important time within the Adventist work, because it was an answer to what our people were dealing with, for the time being. And so I think it's important for us to understand just that there our people might have not have gotten it right the entire time, but they were definitely doing it with intentions um of trying to not be as harmful as it could have been, I think. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Okay, we're having some technical difficulties, but with Kevin, but he's gonna probably pop back in here, so we'll wait for that. But in 1900, 1950, you talked about the Thousand Women. We kind of hit that. But Michael, can you talk a little bit more about when Ellen White died, um, and the controversy surrounding that with regards to the misinterpretation of her words, the white Jesus that comes up? Can you share some of those things?
Yeah, I have a chapter in my 1922 book, I think, that talks about that. But after, it's interesting how Ellen White dies in 1915, as you mentioned, and I think one of the challenges is how to face the reality of moving forward without a living prophet. So when she's alive, when people would misuse and abuse her writings, I mean, she could call them out on the carpet and say, that's wrong, and so on. And she's no longer around to kind of be like, okay, hey, you guys are mistreating Edson White in the Morning Star. Like, you need to play nice and actually support, because the work he's doing is really important. So she had some really strong messages of reproof. And so, yeah, I think fundamentalism, in particular, the early 20th century, this idea of proof texting, a rigid and an errant kind of way of approaching inspired writings, lent itself to, and this is always the danger, that you begin to make inspired writings into your own image. You begin to make even Ellen White into your own image. That's the danger. And so you begin to see as the racism is institutionalized within broader society, and even within the church. And this idea of a white Jesus, this is something that becomes idealized, right? I mean, Jesus would have been a Middle Easterner, so he wouldn't have been white or black. He would have been of some kind of Middle Eastern kind of hue, I suppose, and yet people begin to make Jesus look white. And this is very interesting how people are doing this. And so this is the danger of inspired writings. If we're not careful, that then we begin to make them say only what we want them to say. We begin to control and manipulate what those writings are saying. And so I think we should always have an attitude of humility. And that's what we learned at the 1919 Bible Conference, right? That's the first major discussion of Ellen White after her death. And that's for the first time we have terms like liberals and progressives being used in Adventism. And it's also because the fundamentalists are scared of the liberals who are social activism. They say, oh, we don't want to be like the modernists and liberals, so let's not do social activism. And so that was a big push away from this activist stance of the earliest pioneers, that, we could be perceived as modernists and liberals. And so so that begins to really dampen the social impact of Adventism. They want to be like Walter Washington Bush and others of the social gospel movement. They're dangerous, and so let's just stay away from that. And so these are all, it's broader context that's taking place. It shouldn't surprise us that Adventists are struggling with these very same things too, and similar patterns. And what I think Adventism is prophetic identity. What I love, to kind of come back to the beginning, is if we allow the apocalyptic filter to put that on, it allows us to waken up and begin to critique the world in which we live in the present. But we can talk more about that later.
Well, it's interesting because you have said some things that remind us of 2026 as it relates to what happened 100 years ago. You can see some elements of Christian nationalism and ideology. You can see some of those things that have taken place during this transitional period. Lisa, as a political scientist and a historian, what are some of the things that kind of jumped out with you? Michael talked about the second awakening of the Ku Klux Klan. He talked about the fundamentalist movement, which was part of American history. What kind of things that you maybe teach, taught about in your classes, or brought out as a professor during that time that you could kind of highlight?
I think that historians always care about context. And I think one of the things that we've talked about over and over is how much more we're influenced by the culture that we're around, rather than allowing the culture of the kingdom of God to shape who we are as people. And so thinking about what it means to be made in the image of God. And when I think about today, when I talk with my students, we know, like, we have a sense that there's progress and that people are getting better. We expect more and more people to improve. This is the modern narrative of the last 250 years, that we should be improving and progress. And I think part of being an apocalyptic people means that we both work for the kingdom of God, which is here and among us, and we live as if we take that seriously, that then there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and we live as if that is serious. But we are not surprised when the world around us reflects greed and materialism, the three evils that Dr. King kind of talked about: militarism and materialism and racism, and those are things that Jesus talks about, incidentally, and so when we say we want to live as if we live in, and that is something that it is hard to do because, like, culture eats theology for breakfast. And so if we can steep ourselves in the word of God and in our belief in the new heaven and the new earth, and how are we living as if we take that seriously, that can inform our politics, that can inform how we practice in our churches, that can allow us to hold gently the fact that I think I know the right way right now, and I'm trying to live and vote and organize and work as if I know the Holy Spirit might have to prompt me to change my mind. And 10, 20, 50 years down the road, people may be critiquing me and critiquing us for how we're living right now. So when I talk to my students, I think about, like, pushing back on the narrative of progress and living as if we believe those values of the new heaven and the new earth right now.
Thank you. Pastor Liz, as a youth pastor, a lot of our young people really don't know about our Adventist history, and especially if you do not attend Adventist school. But growing up, I went to Ruth Murdoch, Andrews Academy, then Oakwood. We did not have these level of discussions about our Adventist history and the contributions it made, and how society was shaped by Adventists, but then how society shaped Adventists. So what do you tell your young people, during this 1900, 1950 movement, with the beginning of regional conferences and things along those lines? How do you share with them that, this, just because what you see today, this is not what our church was always about?
Yeah, I think it's important for anyone to know their history and to know where they come from, right? Ellen White herself writes about, or says that, unless we have nothing to fear for the future, unless we forget how God has led us in the past. And in order to know how God has led you in the past, like, you have to understand what that past looks like. And so I think framing it for our kids, so that they can understand and value what Adventism brings to the table, and who we are. Like, we are steeped in people who rallied against injustice, who rallied against against just hurt. And so I think it's really important. And then I also think it's important, moreover, like, our history is very important. They need to know that, but they also need to, I tell my kids at the end of the day, like, we need to be able to stand on the word, right? And the Bible, time and time again, repeatedly emphasizes that God calls his people to justice. Isaiah 117 tells us that. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Like, that's all people who are going through some stuff, right? And so God does not call us to passivity. The pioneers modeled this for us, and they modeled this by opposing slavery even at their own personal risk. So today I like to tell our kids, like, God still calls us to identify injustice and to act, whether that's racial inequality, whether that's poverty, whether that's immigration laws, whether that's systemic oppression. We have to be able to have some skin in the game, right? Because we can sit and we can talk about all kinds of theories, but at the end of the day, like, if we are not doing anything about it, if we are not putting our hand to the plow, if we are not working, then all we're doing is we're just being hearers of the word and not doers of the word. And the Bible tells us that we need to be doers and not just hearers. So I think it's important to know our history, and then it's also important that we act. Like, it's important that we do something about it.
No, and I appreciate that as we transition to 1950 to 2000. I really appreciate. I have a better appreciation for our church. So many times you hear the negative aspects, but when you notice the different people, the allies, people that have been moved by the Holy Spirit, you understand, you could distinguish the system from the people. You could distinguish the system from the people. And I think that's very important, because so many times we paint a broad brush and label everybody the same. And that is not true despite our history. We've always had a remnant. We've always had a few people who were willing to go against the grain and speak truth to power. And we see that as a result of looking through our history, as relates to Adventists, because there's no question that we have the right message. No question whatsoever in terms of our doctrines. We're very sound, but sometimes people who have been in practice and leadership positions, or sometimes even members, have not acted according to the light. And we need to be very specific about that versus painting a broad brush. Having said that, we can do better, and we should do better, and we should push for better. And that's what I appreciate about the guests that we have, is that they push for better. They give a constructive critique, but they push for better. And to be honest with you, they're openly refreshing and transparent. And we need more of that. We don't have enough of these discussions or conversations. And our history, we need to be buying the books from Michael Campbell, the books from Kevin Burton, Calvin Rock, and Samuel London, and Douglas Morgan, and Lewis B. Reynolds, and so on, that have contributed, and C.E. Dudley, that have talked about our Adventist history. I just think we're missing it. And we need to talk more about that, Liz, to be honest with you, at our youth congresses, our youth federations, our GYC, and others, because I think we're ignorant of our history. And as a result, we're repeating it because we don't talk about it. And then it is like a generational thing where we really should be back. We should be together. I mean, we should be together. Granted, we got regional conferences because we asked for integration and received segregation, but that was 80 years ago. What can we do now? Okay, yeah. Can we get integration? And if we can, what does that look like? And those are some of the things we'll ask as we end the show. But just wanted to have some discussion to kind of move people along. I see some questions in the chat that we'll get back to. 1950 to 2000. Obviously, we have segregation. We have the Korean War during this time. We have the Vietnam War. We have the Civil Rights Movement during this time. we have the beginning as we go to the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and that movement, the Christian Coalition. All of this is happening between 1950 to 2000. Talk a little bit about that and where we stood. Michael, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, it's slightly before 1950, but I mean, I think anybody that studies the history, every once in a while, I have somebody say, well, why do we have regional conferences? And well, if you have to understand the history, if you understand the story of how regional conferences came about, it's a compelling story. And you have to say, wow, this is incredible because, I mean, from everything from Lucy Bayard to her tragic and untimely death to I mean, losing Louis Sheaf, and his church is still in Washington, D.C. Every once in a while, I do tours of Black Adventist history and of women's history in D.C. The sites are still there, and I like people to see them, touch them. Don't go inside them because they're privately owned, but because I want people to know this is a real part of our history. We had some setbacks. We lost people that were really influential and significant. And so by learning their stories, and Black Adventism after regional conferences, which were imposed upon them by church leaders, they said, okay, this is what we think can happen. But it provided a venue through which there could be evangelism, there could be, and the Black Adventist church community grew double through the 20th century. And so if you look at our recent book, Global History, Seventh-day Adventists, we actually have the figures, the stats in there, because we want people to know these are the facts so you can see how Adventism has changed and transformed through the second half of the 20th century. And the more recent the history, the more challenging the history, because I mean, starts to get uncomfortable. I had a friend of mine say, I picked up your book and then I got really uncomfortable because these are things that I remembered from that I experienced. And so that's always the challenge. Because again, there's moments where we see, it's amazing. Like 20th century, one of my favorite stories, mid 20th century, is Fernando Stahl and Lake Titicaca, and they worked against racial oppression of those native indigenous peoples there. And today there's a statue to the Stahls, and because they helped to empower through reading and through spirituality and through the Adventist message, changed an entire people group to allow them to not be subjugated like they were before. So there's moments of incredible progress, and we see incredible challenge too, where Adventism, where church leaders were putting the thumb on people to try to get them to not participate in the civil rights movement. And I look back and say, I wish our church had been a little bit more open-minded, that we could have seen a little bit more support. And yet even still there's bright spots like MLK speaking at Oakwood, So we need to tell the story and the history as honestly, but lovingly. But as we look at those things, it can hopefully challenge us. And so we celebrate the good, and then we look at the moments of challenge and say, how can we learn from that? And so that we take history with moral purpose, and so that we can hopefully learn from it, hopefully, that in ways that create constructive conversations in our communities and churches that will allow us to take the ideals and the best of Adventism, our earliest pioneers that we began this show with, to say, hey, how can we live that out right now in my life, right here, right now in the present?
Thank you so much for that, Liz.
Sorry, Pastor Woody, could you repeat that question one more time? I got lost in what Dr. Campbell was saying.
We're just
not lost, like in it. I was in it.
The time period of 1950 to 2000, with regards to civil rights movement. We had the Korean War, Vietnam War. He mentioned that the church, was formerly not supportive of the civil rights movement, but we did have some bright spots in terms of people. When you look at our Adventist historians like C.E. Dudley, Pastor Earl Moore, Pastor C.D. Joseph, our president from the Lake Region Conference, who's a mentor of mine, who I love dearly and still miss, in terms of speaking truth to power. You also had, Randy Stafford, that desegregated the Meridian School with regards to that. So just different things, during that 1950 to kind of 2000 period is what we're talking about right now. So any
Yeah,
highlights for you?
yeah, definitely. During that time, I think as I'm going back into my history lessons myself, I think there was definitely the fact that I think the church was really kind of avoiding um what can I say? Like early on and like after the 1950s, like I feel like the church was really kind of avoiding activism. We know that like Ellen White died and the church was kind of navigating that a little bit. When I think of our early pioneers, sometimes I like to think of them kind of like how we think about our parents. Like they did the best that they could, but they definitely fell short. There are some traumas that they handed off to us that we wish they didn't hand off to us, but yet nonetheless we have inherited it. And so I think the church was avoiding kind of political activism at that time. They were kind of emphasizing um, this spiritual witness. I think Dr. Diller had mentioned I earlier was that they were emphasizing what it meant to be spiritual witnesses versus social protest, right? And so even like even as we were navigating that, we get into kind of the 1980s. And here we're starting to like address what it means to like have integration more openly. There are discussions happening around us, but still like we're having to deal with the civil rights movement. We are having to deal with and again, not a historian. These are just my opinions. So feel free to be like your opinions, Liz, are totally off base. Um, but we're dealing with the civil rights movement. And so like the 60s, we're at this like height. It's kind of the apex of the civil rights movements as I saw it. And the church is navigating through this. And so the racial reconciliation is happening or is trying to happen. The dialogues are happening, but I think there wasn't enough um push from our church. In a way, I think we just we wanted to avoid being labeled as a church who wasn't doing anything, but at the same time we didn't do enough. Like it just comes down to we did not do enough. Our parents did not do enough and they handed down some trauma to us, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Lisa.
I mean, I think it's hard when you are like, our fundamentalist moment lasts, through, I don't know how long, Michael, but, the 60s at least, when people then started kind of going to grad school and you started having some different kinds of ideas out there and after the 20th century. But I think we felt like anything that was like politically active was allying us with the modernists to go back to the World War I, but it's still going on. Like in the 70s, people who were going to seminary in the 70s, like I think about my parents' age, going to graduate school at Loma Linda and Andrews University in the late 60s and early 70s, they were sure we were this close to ordaining women. Like they were encouraging women to go into the seminary. Like, you start having some of the early people like, but what happens is they're like, oh, if the world is doing it, if the world is protesting, if the world is out there and they're doing it for secular reasons, we can't be involved in that because that means we're buying into what the world does. And I think we have a really hard time in the 20th century thinking about just because the world is doing God's spirit is abroad in the world and people for secular reasons are doing justice doesn't mean we need to like we were the peculiar people. We saw ourselves as like we're not like the world. So if they're all arguing for racial rights and gender rights, that means we shouldn't be doing it. And so we have lawsuits that force the church to pay people the same, women that had the same job as men, that make it possible for us to have equality. And so it's a herky jerky. We have a lot of progress. We have the first women being ordained coming into since the 19th century and kind of coming into their own. But we also have a big backlash because that's all seen as being part of like secular worldly things.
I call it the fundamentalist temptation.
Once again, now let's go from 1950 to 2000. So we have 2000 to 2025. You still have the evolution of the moral majority, the Christian coalition. We have that going on. We have the election of Barack Obama that takes place during this time period. You have the election of Donald Trump. You have Christian nationalism. You have evangelicalism coming up. You have what's so-called culture wars. You have the rejection. You have diversity, equity, inclusion. Now the rejection of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You have the critique of critical race theory. And all of these things are happening in society and impacting the church. And then we have what's happening with immigration during this time period as well. 2015, I think it was March of 2015, the Adventist Church within the USA Today as the fastest growing movement. But the bulk of the growth of the Adventist Church is really immigrant growth. We are challenged, baptized. I don't care if you're white or black, Native, people who are born in America. There's a challenge with regards to baptism and retention, and our growth is really coming from immigration. During this time period, and then 2025, and then we have the advent of social media, the distortion of AI images, all of that taking place to kind of prove a point. We had the memes of the Obamas that came out, a couple of weeks ago. You had the deaths of Alex Preddy and Renee Good as a result of Minneapolis. And we're seeing more, it's kind of highlighted that the secular world is driving the moral conversation on human dignity, sufferings, and rights more so than the church. So kind of talk about this particular period. And Michael, we'll let you go first, and then Lisa, you'll go next, and then Liz.
It's difficult because, again, we've seen complexity and so on, and we see new kinds of challenges that we didn't have before. And this was part of the challenge of writing this new book that Global History Seventh-day Adventists, I think, were the first ones to write from 2000 to 2025. I don't know, Lisa, but I think we're at least the first to really tackle it in a very serious, comprehensive way. So our last chapter is that very thing, is kind of looking at the last 25 years or so. We stopped last summer because we turned in our manuscript like year and a half ago, but our editors were kind enough to let us add a couple last minute little details from last summer. And that's really where we stopped. But we see once again, the same kinds of challenges of race and gender, of immigration. You have, various phenomena of where, and this raises a fundamental question that I think Lisa raised earlier, that we've kind of hinted at throughout this evening, is, does our faith inform our culture and politics, how we see things around us, or is our culture and politics and whatever else, that milieu, is that informing our faith? So which comes first, right? And I would like to think that Adventism, again, at its best, is what should shape all these other kinds of things. But more often than not, I'm afraid, from what I see, is that people see themselves aligned with a political candidate, with a certain movement. We have a very strong push towards for example, the evangelical right and Christian nationalism, anti-immigration. Like, these are kinds of things that Adventism has historically critiqued and expressed concern about. What does this mean for our understanding of end time events, all of this stuff, and where we have people really wrestling with that. And the danger is, the more recent the history, like I said before, the more sensitive it is. We're starting to step on toes because it's people I actually know, that are trying to push for certain things, and that you begin to start seeing those kinds of pulses. But you do see them, and they're very real, and they're the very same kinds of challenges that Adventism has faced from its very beginnings. And so we have to take stock with that and ask ourselves some hard questions. What does it mean to be an Adventist in 2026? Is it just the fact that we show up for church on Saturday versus other churches go to church on Sunday? or is there a deeper meaning to that experience, and what it means to be Adventist that allows us, again, and I'd like to think, again, the great controversy framework, all of these different kinds of things. We see injustice, we see people trying to, that are talking, against immigration, and immigrants right now. And are we willing to stand up and say, hey, that is actually wrong, and we need to, and can we approach it with more nuance so that we're not just kind of entering in and that everything's black and white, but we can see maybe some of the complexity and nuance that allows us to be able to see some of the shades of gray in between, so to speak, of some of these different debates. They're very real. They're very significant. And as I've talked to certain people that, we're facing challenges of Christian nationalism. We're facing challenges of race and immigration. And maybe that shouldn't surprise us, because as we look through our Adventist history, those have been our challenges from the very beginning.
I think part of our challenge is the decentralization of authority that comes with the decentralization of communication. So there isn't any like top down, like there's what, like my young people, I'm sure this is true for Pastor Adams's young people as well. They're not looking to hear what the General Conference has to say, or I'm sorry, Michael, the North American Division, has to say about.
Most people probably don't know what the North American Division is, Lisa. So
that's very true. But they're not looking for that anymore. They aren't at the same time, they want their church to quote unquote officially speak for things. But then my friends are like, why isn't the church blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, in what form could the church inform you? And whatever you mean by the church, you're just talking about your local church with your local church pastor? Are you talking about the school that you went to? Do you follow any of the church social media? Do you get publications? Otherwise, how do you know what the church is saying anyway? But they still want the church to officially speak on these things. But I would say, so that we're calling out for that. But I think we're also there for people who, whether they are church employees or not, who are standing up and saying, like, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, I'm part of this, is my theology, and I'm doing the work that I'm doing out of this theology. And we're sharing more of those stories now as media expands. There are more people doing things for that, kind of in the post 2000 years, the last 26 years. And there's people working for the government that we see that are on our political side or not on our political side. I think I like us working for political change, but I do miss maybe a time period when we kind of said we were nonpartisan and we didn't engage as much in partisan politics. And it feels a little bit hard nowadays to like work for issues and not feel like one is partisan. I want my students to like not be so engaged with the political parties and feel like they're the good of the world rises and falls on whether a certain political party comes or goes into power. This is part of what our theology tells us, is the powers of this world are corrupt, all of them. And while I do work for change in the world, I should not be surprised. And too much of my emotional energy is being spent trying to think about whether my guys win, in one way or the other. And what I need to work for is the good of the kingdom of God. And yes, I'm a person who votes. I'm not, I'm not saying that we pretend this is not happening, but too much of our emotional investment happens in thinking that somehow the powers of this world are going to get it right and do it right and not be totally up to their elbows in the blood of the innocent. All of them, the powers of this world. That is what states do. And so I want to continue to celebrate my fellow Adventists and be inspired by them and encouraged by them, who tell us stories about our past and then root our work for God and for each other in our theology and in our history of our tradition.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. I think a big part of, when I think about this, especially as we're thinking about 2000 to 2025, or even 2026. But I think about the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King said that in the end, it's not the words of our enemies that we remember, it's the silence of our friends. right? And I'm always thinking about that because I'm like, as an ally, like as people who are who can put ourselves into someone else's shoes, like we have to be able to speak up. Like, and so I look at our church and I hear what you're saying, Dr. Diller, about the looking at the church and expecting the church to say something, and like, who do you expect to speak up, right? But like, I think at the end of the day, like for me and for the young people that I serve and that God has called me to serve and to help, foster their relationships with Christ. I think at the end of the day, um, we want to know, or they want to know, that the people who kind of make policies and the people who make the decisions in the church that they are in are people who are for them, like that they are people who have their back, that they are people who understand what they're going through. And our church, especially in the light of just recent events, I just feel like our church is very reactive versus proactive. Like I need us to, like, I don't need us to rah-rah against the machine, but I definitely need us to make a stance, you know? And so I think this is when I said and I answered, are Adventists still abolitionists? And I'm like, as a whole, like we definitely, I don't feel like we are. I feel like there are segments that are abolitionists, or there are segments that are actively working, but Adventism as a whole is not standing up for for the oppressed. We're not standing up and speaking out against just things that are wrong, that are happening against us. So I do wish that our church would make more of a stance and make it clear, like, we're on such a wide spectrum that we can fall anywhere. But I think at the end of the day, like, we are called to care for people, and our young people, our kids, our young people, our youth, our young adults, like, they want to know that at the end of the day, like, their lives mean something, and people have their backs, and the people that make the policies, like, they care about what they're going through. So I think that's where we are, kind of 2025.
Can I just can I add a little something to what you're saying, Liz, and what Lisa was saying, just really quick on and I'm sorry we lost Kevin. One of the arguments I've heard him make elsewhere, I don't want to speak for him, but since he couldn't be here, I've heard him make the point, I believe, I hope I'm representing this accurately, but our earliest Adventists were very political. But what Ellen White warns against is being partisan, loyalty to a party or to a person. But when you talk about political, they were very activists in terms of wanting to change and do something about it. And I love Ellen White, who, when there was temperance legislation and they tried to hold the election on Sabbath to make sure that the Adventists didn't vote, she goes with fellow believers in the wagon and it says, bring brings down the church, basically, to all go down and vote. This is real Adventist history. And this is Ellen White. Even though she warns about being partisan, she did not see that as being dissonance, any kind of dissonance with what she was teaching about about her other councils. And so there's a difference. There's a very important difference between being partisan and being political. The other thing is, we don't always necessarily know all the different ways that our church is working against racial injustice. We definitely sometimes see, like, oh man, I wish our church did more there or whatever. I will say this, that there have been significant protests. There's been concerns about immigration recently, where I've seen Adventists stepping up and helping other Adventists that were, in the midst of, maybe getting taken by ICE agents or whatever, And the question is, how does one act when those things come to your back door, into your neighborhood, into your faith community, in your church? These are fellow church members that maybe are caught up and swept up in this. And so that's where we need to be agents of change and agents of grace, where we are helping others around us within our sphere of influence to the best of our ability and following the example of Jesus Christ. And so what that looks like might look a little bit different for every single one of us, but all of us have the opportunity and the privilege to exert our circle of influence. And so I would say we do need to think very carefully, just like our pioneers, at the world around us and how God may be asking us to do what we can to act for the kingdom of God here on earth.
And I appreciate that, Michael, because I think, to be honest with you, our public affairs and religious liberty ministry is really an evangelistic and a retention tool. I would say a discipleship and a retention tool. The Bible is very clear. By this, we will know that we are his disciples for our love for one another. We can't paint everybody with the same brush, but we can speak truth to power and we can be supportive. Most of you are denominational employees and you're very free in terms of speaking your opinions, sometimes to your own peril about what the church needs to be doing. But I can tell you, you made a difference from someone that probably didn't know that we had voices like yours out there. Because I can tell you, growing up in predominantly white Adventist institutions, I didn't hear the Lisa Clark Dillers. I didn't hear the Michael Campbells. I didn't hear the Liz Adams. And I didn't hear the Kevin Burtons. I just didn't hear it growing up. I didn't know our history until after I graduated from our schools. And so you don't know how much of an appreciation and respect that I have for you and your willingness to do the work that you do, even to your own prayer, because I didn't know. And I went to Adventist schools. My parents sacrificed from kindergarten all the way till I graduated from Oakwood. And, this stuff is not out there. It's not popular for it to be out there. And I think it's, it has created, in my opinion, some retention issues. I think when people know more about our history and know that we're not perfect, just like the disciples of Christ, we're not perfect. Peter struggled and Paul had to call him out. As we look in Galatians 2, he had to call him out. We need to find a way where we can be truly the remnant church, as a people, they that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Because our first 4 commandments, as we know, is our love to the Lord, but our last 6 is our love to our brothers and sisters in Christ. So I do want to thank you, and I want you to feel my sincerity in this virtual space for what you are doing. And as you said, Michael, sometimes we don't know what the church is doing, and that is true, but the church also needs to communicate what it's doing, and it needs to enforce the statements and the actions. We have this one humanity document that is great, but the Bible supersedes the one humanity document, and we had to affirm the Bible through a one humanity document. That's a problem for me. The hours we spent doing that, the committees that had to go through to approve something that is clearly biblical. And so we have to acknowledge these challenges. And I'm gonna tell you, that made a difference for me and my wife when it comes to raising our kids. We had to tell the truth. We couldn't sugarcoat. You guys are sugarcoating it. You got a company line. You got a company speech. When will you tell us the truth? Stop doing it. Why can't you be open and transparent? And so I want my kids to know that there's Michael Campbell's, Lisa Clark Diller, Liz Adams, Kevin Burtons, and others. I want my kids to know the people that made a difference, that saw me when I was in elementary school, like Loretta Van Dynen, Donald Weaker, Dixie Scott. They saw me and valued me, had words of encouragement, for me that I will never forget, even in my adulthood. I remember how they inspired me and made sure that they knew that I felt that I was special and took the time out to do that. You will never know how much that means to me. And I think we don't have the opportunity, which is unfortunate. We need a layman's conference. I do believe that, where we can bring people together to have these conversations, because although our leaders have tried, the results have not taken place as I feel they should have. And so maybe it's time for the lay movement, to rise up and look at how we can do some of these resources and have these conversations. We had a frank conversation. No one turned beet red, at least I didn't. I can say that honestly, with regards to the conversation. And we were able to share. And we don't have that. We don't have camp meeting together. The only time we get together is usually a constituency meeting, and that's usually a union one because we have our separate conferences, regional state conferences. There's no division meeting, so we have GC. That's once every 5 years, but we just don't come together and talk and try to and push the agenda that the church is really not accomplishing. We have some bright spots, but in terms of tangible results, we should be further ahead 80 years from 80 years ago on racism, classism, ageism, ableism, sexism. We should be further ahead. And that's what we are committed to doing through this show. And I just want to thank you and know that you're appreciated and respected, and that God's anointing is on you, just in case you have some foes or enemies who speak out against you and your work and what you're doing. God's anointing is on you, and you are doing the Lord's work. And because of that, other people will see a difference, and they will have this moment in time on February 13th. We heard some people, our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, who valued us, and who looked at us as human beings. And as a result, I have a different appreciation for the Adventist church because I painted them with one brush, but I realized I couldn't do that because we have some people here who are willing to speak truth to power and to share in an open and transparent way our struggles, but once again, our opportunities, because there are opportunities still left before Christ returns where we can get this right. And I really believe this public affairs and religious liberty ministry is the most integral ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in these last days and times, not only from a discipleship standpoint, but a retention standpoint where we can change the world one person at a time through the gospel of Jesus Christ. So once again, I want to thank Dr. Lisa Clark Diller, Dr. Michael Campbell, and Pastor Liz Adams. And I want to end, there was a question by Carmela Monk Crawford. Michael, you referenced her earlier as a colleague of yours with Message Magazine editor, and we do love Carmela. She's a great partner with the Conscience and Justice.
Absolutely.
With Message Magazine. And she had a quote about basically saying, where do we go from here? And I think that's just, it's fitting. Dr. King says that, where do we go from here? She's saying that with this discussion, where do we go from here in addressing our Adventist Still Abolitionists and what we can do. Here it is right here. What kind of things would you like to see us do and be involved as modern abolitionists? I think that's a great place where we can end our discussion tonight. And once again, thank you individually and collectively for your investment in speaking with us tonight. But I want to end with your words. Thank you. Liz, we'll start with you.
Oh, I was muted. There we go. You guys hear me? Yes. That is a great question. What can we do moving forward? I think it's really important that, again, as we're talking about being abolitionists, it's actively working. I think I saw someone ask in the chat, um, say in the chat that we can't constantly preach the three angels message and not talk about people who are in need and people who, I think, like, even our three angels message encompasses you know helping the unjust. We're talking about fear God and give glory to him. Like, fearing God means to live ethically and responsibly, right? And so I think that's a big part of that. Like, Babylon has fallen. We know that Babylon had to do with, like, oppression and corruption and systems that are unjust and confusion. And I think, as we're talking about Babylon has fallen, like, spiritually, this is a call to actively oppose. Again, the word is active. Actively oppose injustice, echoing what our pioneers said. And then, of course, this, if anyone worships the beast and its image, and receives its mark, I think the beast, part of the beast image is definitely aligning with oppression and exploitation. We can take it in that direction. So by extension, like, our silence, our apathy, our passive what's the word I'm looking for? Complicit in injustice is spiritually dangerous. Like, we have to be actively working. Like, how do you find out, like, what's going on in your community? What can you do in your community to help people who might, who might be afraid of, like, coming out of their homes because ICE is around the corner? What can you do to say, hey, let me partner with my churches in the community who are doing things to help people who are going through some real life issues. Like, we're talking about actual things that affect people. And there are a lot of, even if the Adventist church is not doing it, there are organizations outside of us who are actively working. And I'm not saying that our Adventist church is not doing it. I'm just, even the Adventist church in your area is not doing it. There are organizations who are actively working to, like, break down barriers and walls. And I think that we would do a lot to be able to stand hand in hand with them and say, hey, how can we assist in this fight against just the injustice that's happening around us?
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm thinking of the young people that Liz represents so well. And sometimes I think it's helpful to ask them what is the injustice around them that they see, like and ask, like, have them kind of just look around and say, what is happening in your communities and neighborhoods that you would like to be involved with? And then let's see how we can do that. But I will say two different things in terms of, like, work for the immigrant and in our current moment, which is a really crisis kind of moment, as well as, like, systems of carceral justice and racial and gender justice and disability and all the other things that we're talking about. Adventists in the abolitionist movement did not invent the wheel themselves. They joined organizations that were already working for this. So your church doesn't have, it can be a lot of effort to think I have to come up with something. Like, so whatever it is, your young people or the people around you, what God has put on your heart, or the people on your heart that is their passion, there is something in your community. I promise you, there are people who are doing things that need hands and feet and energy and, people showing up to the thing. So, like, doing a little research, finding that out, and then as the people of God, doing it as the people of God collectively, because you are followers of Jesus, not, just because, you have a bleeding heart for people around you, which is great. You should do that. But, because we're followers of Jesus, like, praying over that work with our young people and then joining in. But even with regards to, like, especially our immigrant communities, as several people have already mentioned, Adventists are an immigrant church. Like, maybe finding out, like, also when in the 2015 to 2024 space, when there was work in our community for interracial conversations, Black Lives Matter sorts of things. Our church has friends in the regional conference churches right down the street from us that we collaborated together on things. We have churches of immigrants. Like, find out from your conference leadership or walk down the street to the church near you if you're in a large enough place where you have that, and find out, what can we do to help? Where can we come alongside you? So being Adventist lowers the barrier, because we already have a bunch of stuff in common, to sort of collaborating that way, if that's the kind of thing you want to do. But even just showing up with whatever organizations are in your church around the issues that God has put on your heart, if that's hunger, if that's, issues of, prison ministry, whether it's work for the elderly and the housebound, whatever it is, and the kids and young people in your church, like, there are organizations doing that, and you as the people of God can come together and join them.
Michael?
So I think it has to be. I think it has to be more than words, and this is what a lot of people are asking. I think it has to be by deed. That's why I say active love, and through our framework of what we believe, all these different kinds of things, and the God we worship, we want to represent Him through all of our actions. But just recently, we had a phone call where there was a husband taken by, I presume, by ICE, but the family is stranded. They were from a foreign country. I didn't know how well they even spoke English. I think of a Middle Eastern background, and they were stuck, stranded, needing basic necessities of food and just survival. And these were people that it turned out were in our backyard. So I'm so grateful for sort of church members, because I was traveling, so I couldn't, different somewhere else. So just like I'm traveling tonight, but just to say that people in our church family rallied together. Someone went and got them. Another family said, "I've got a spare bedroom." Someone else said, "I can give them some food." And these are the realities of our world in which we live in the present. And so I celebrate some of my fellow church members that were able to reach out to someone very different from them, maybe, in terms of ethnicity, language, and everything else, found themselves in a very precarious, vulnerable moment. And it's people in the margins of society that are suffering, and that are in the midst. This is our reality right now, and this wasn't on the news. This probably never will be on the news. It's just that this is the person that was at our doorstep. And so within our sphere of influence, God calls us to have active love. And so we need to, I think, more than ever, this is what I think the three angels message is all about. It's the most compelling revelation of God's character and his love. And when we see how good God is, that means that we want to work for the kingdom of heaven and represent the goodness of that loving God in heaven to every person here on this planet. That's our mission. That's why we exist. And every human being on this planet has value, because they're made in the image of God, what we call the Imago Dei. And that gives us reason and rationale that again, why we work against oppression and against all these different kinds of things, because we serve a living God. So active love would be my response.
Thank you. In closing, I want to read 1 John 3:16 to 18, New International Version. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and truth. Once again, I want to thank God for Dr. Kevin Burton, Dr. Lisa Clark Diller, Dr. Michael W. Campbell, and Pastor Liz Adams for joining us today as we dealt with this subject. Our Adventists, Still Abolitionists, want to invite you to join us next week when we talk about Black Adventists in America, divided or united. We'll be talking about the different ethnicities, whether you're African American, whether you're Jamaican, whether you're Haitian, whether you're from Trinidad, or whether you're from a particular country in Africa or Central America. We're going to be talking about this discussion and having this discussion with Dr. Olive Hemmings, Dr. Sidney Freeman, Dr. Jason O'Rourke, and Dr. Daniel Pilgrim. Once again, thank you to each and every one of you for coming out tonight. God bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you and give you peace. Good night, everyone. Thank you again.